I know we've come a long way. We're changing day to day. But tell me, where do the children play?
In general, women and children are rendered more useful, and the latter more early useful, by manufacturing establishments.
The most beautiful sight that we see is the child at labor. As early as he may get at labor, the beautiful. That more useful does his life get to be.
Child labor.
A revolution whose time had come.
Child labor has long been a part of U.S. history. However, it was during the Industrial Revolution that the number of children employed increased dramatically. At the turn of the century, there are over 2 million children employed in U.S. mines, factories, and other areas of industry. From this, a revolution occurred that resulted in the abuse of this labor force. As attitudes changed, the public reacted and reform was made with the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Though today we look at child labor in a negative way, in colonial times it was expected, promoted, and considered a blessing. To them, it made money and kept the children out of trouble. In one Virginian law, it directly stated that child labor should be promoted to avoid sloth and idleness, wherein young children are easily corrupted.
In 1790, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, the first textile mill was built in Blackstone Valley of Massachusetts. By the height of the revolution, there were 1,100 factories on this one river. But these factories needed workers, and the most obvious solution was children. They were cheap, numerous, and had nimble fingers. At the time, there wasn't mandatory schooling, so there was little reason not to work.
From the parents' point of view, the children were helping to feed the family. With so much cheap labor, America was soon able to produce 1/3 of all the world's production. Hiring children lowered adults' wages tremendously, because why hire someone who wants to be paid more than someone who is willing to work for less?
Children were soon working with dangerous machinery and coal mines. This caused children to lose fingers, legs, and even their lives. According to the United States Bureau of Statistics, in 1908, the death rate from tuberculosis among child laborers in cotton mills was double of that of other boys not employed in the mills, and girls was more than doubled. During World War I in munitions factories, it was found that child laborers were more susceptible to poisoning from the explosives. Almost 80% of the poisoning fatalities were from child laborers.
The children also worked long hours. In one state, one half of the boys in canning factories worked at least 14 hours a day, and many worked from 60 to 90 hours a week. This left little time for school, making them fall behind and in most cases drop out. Early child labor also created an unskilled labor force whose earnings never rose sufficient to support a family when they became adult workers. With the children being treated so harshly and the adults' wages going down, there are many people and organizations that became involved. One group that fought against child labor was the National Child Labor Committee.
In 1836, the first child labor law was passed in Massachusetts, and soon other states started passing laws against employing children. To understand the effect of these laws, let's take a look at New York State. According to the New York Times, in 1880, there were 100,000 children working in New York City alone. In 1884 and 1885, New York State tried to pass laws to make it illegal for children under 12 to work in factories and to not work over 60 hours a week. However, this legislation was considered too limiting and the laws failed to pass.
Finally, in 1886, New York passed laws limiting child labor. However, there was little enforcement. With almost 43,000 factories in the state of New York, there were only 2 inspectors. In 1889, a total of 3 factories had been fined an average of $20. The southern states, relying on child labor for their textile mills, had several states with no laws against child labor. This lack of state support and enforcement resulted in several attempts at federal legislation.
Between 1906 and 1916, there were several federal bills that were attempted to stop child labor. The 2 that had the most effect was the 1906 Beveridge Child Labor Act and the 1916 Keating-Owen Act. Both acts used the federal government to ban goods produced by child labor from interstate commerce. When they presented the Beveridge bill to President Roosevelt, he was sympathetic to their cause. However, he deemed the bill unconstitutional. Roosevelt did grant funding for a comprehensive study, and Congress also approved the creation of the U.S. Children's Bureau, although there was heated support both for and against these bills.
The conscience of the nation is aroused over the slaughter of the innocents and the blighting of the lives of tens of thousands of children who have fallen victims to the greed of gain.
The children are hurried from the cradle into the factories with no childhood, no sweet memories of playtime or of home, nothing for them but toil from morning until night. In this free land they are toiling under the glorious flag of liberty to satisfy the greed of commercialism.
My father put me to work in a cotton mill when I was 11 years of age, because he found that to be the easiest way he could make a living for a large family. And the older I got, the more I got the high regard for his judgment.
It would bring hardship on a large number of people. We have state laws in South Carolina that give us all the protection we need.
The Keating-Owen Act became law. However, the Executive Committee of Southern Cotton Manufacturers, an organization designed to defeat federal child labor laws, was committed to challenge the constitutionality. 1 month before the law came into effect, the cotton manufacturers hired Roland Dagenhart, a man who worked at a factory with his young sons, to send a complaint to Congress that the law was violating his rights. In Hammer v. Dagenhart, the Supreme Court ruled the Keating-Owen Act was unconstitutional, as the federal government does not have the right to regulate interstate commerce.
During this time, the public was becoming more aware of the plight of child labor. From 1908 to 1916, Congress hired Lewis Hine to go throughout the United States, taking pictures of the terrible working conditions that the children had to go through every day. His pictures were very influential because it showed that the problems of child labor were real and that it should be stopped. His pictures were used by the National Child Labor Committee to make posters that influenced people across the United States.
In 1922 and again in 1937, Congress decided that since they couldn't get laws passed because they were unconstitutional, they would change the Constitution, but this failed to work because the southern states failed to ratify it. By 1932, every state had laws against employing children, but enforcement was still uneven. That year, a comprehensive study by a congressional subcommittee made the recommendation for a federal child labor law.
Finally, in 1938, Congress created the Fair Labor Standards Act. This act restricts the hours and types of hazardous work youth under the age of 16 can perform. It was deemed constitutional and had no trouble becoming a law. However, by the time the federal government was finally getting support to enact legislation, the child labor was not as big of an issue.
Historically, without mandatory education, a large number of children were available for employment. However, by 1918, all states required children to attend school, leaving little or no time to work. Over the next 28 years, school enrollment exploded with an average of 1 school being built every day. The Fair Labor Standards Act effect on child labor was also lessened due to the fact that during this time the United States was involved in the Great Depression. This left a large labor force that would work for any wage. Adult workers replaced child laborers.
Today, child labor is a problem in developing countries and periodically a problem in the United States.
The U.S. Department of Labor fined 3 farms in southwest Washington for using child labor. One of the children was just 6 years old.
From the starting of the Industrial Revolution, which abused the child labor force, to the reaction of the people, and the reform of the Fair Labor Standards Act, there have been many reasons that changed America from a society where child labor was expected to a society where it was looked on with scornful eyes and considered barbaric. But even today, there is still room for improvement.
I know we've come a long way. We're changing day to day. But tell me, where do the children play?